Hello again, Mrs. Gilmore's second graders. This is Mrs. Frank, and I'm reading you another chapter of Appleseed Farm. This is part 2, chapter 2, and it's called A Strange Arrival. If you remember, it had just been Ada's birthday, and no one remembered. Apparently, birthdays aren't remembered out in the hard wilderness. A strange arrival. For a long time, Ada lay on the ground beside the spring. She felt very empty and tired. Then something caught her attention. She was not sure why she looked up, for there was only the rustle of leaves and the splash of the spring, but her senses had grown quick from living on the frontier. She knew that some creature was watching her. Perhaps it was a wolf, or it might be a rattlesnake, or an Indian. Ada held her breath, and her scalp prickled in fear. Then she gathered all of her courage and looked about. There, facing her, stood a man. For a second, Ada was too frightened to cry out. After that, she did not want to. The man's eyes and his smile told her that he would never do anything to harm anyone. Yet he was the strangest-looking man she had ever seen. He was of medium height and very thin. His gray hair touched his shoulders, and his clothes were the strangest of all the strange clothes Ada had seen in the backwoods. He wore a burlap coffee sack for a shirt, and his bare legs stuck out below the short, faded overalls. This funny outfit was topped by a wide-brimmed hat made of cardboard. And yet, after her first glimpse at this curious costume, Ada forgot all about it. A lean and frightened dog trotted up, but at Ada's quick movement, he bounded back into the woods like a wild thing. "We smelled the water," the man said, evidently speaking for the dog as well as himself. "Do you mind if we take a drink?" Then, without waiting for an answer, he scooped up a handful. "Some folks like coffee," he said as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, "and some like tea, but I say that God made a better drink than man could ever think of. Do you care if I sit down and rest here a spell?" Again, without waiting for an answer, the man sat down on the ground, his back against a tree. Both he and Ada sat perfectly quiet for a while. Ada had no fear of the stranger, for she knew that he was a friend. "Is that your dog?" she finally asked. "Mine," the man repeated. "No, he's his own, I guess." But he called the dog, which obediently trotted back and, after sniffing at Ada, drank at the spring and then settled down beside his companion. The man patted the dog's head. He was kicked most to death by a good-for-nothing master. So I paid a few pennies to save his life, and we've been traveling together ever since. But he's still afeard of almost everybody. "Not of you," Ada said. "No," the man agreed. "I've taken care of him. Besides, I'm always friends with everyone. That's the way I feel, and of course all creatures, dumb animals, Indians, children, and sometimes even grown-ups, understand if you feel that way." He was quiet for a moment, then he threw his head back, pursed his lips, and began to whistle bird songs. Ada had not noticed any birds that morning, but now the woods were full of them, and this man, who was friends with all living creatures, seemed to know their language. He imitated their calls until Ada half believed he was talking to them. "You have some fine company here," the stranger told her. "That redbird is my favorite. Birds don't come prettier or with a sweeter song. Cheer, cheer up, cheer up, cheer up, he tells you. He can be happy for days on end just watching these wood birds. Still," he added, as recalling his manners, "it's nice to meet a little girl like you. You and your folks must be new settlers in these parts." "We've been here more than a year," Ada told him. "We came all the way from Boston. It seems like 1,000 years ago." "I'm from Boston, too," the man told her. "But by your count, I left there 1,000,000 years ago. Well, how are you making out on the frontier?" Tears welled up again in Ada's eyes as she thought of their troubles. The man said. "I reckon the drought last summer burned your father's corn." Ada nodded. "And a wolf killed Daisy, our cow," she managed to tell them. "Then my little brother took sick and couldn't live anymore. My mother has never been the same since." "The wilderness likes to test folks," the man declared. He gave Ada a long look and asked, "What do they call you?" She told him, and he repeated the name after her. "About 10 years old, aren't you, Ada?" "10 today, but of course birthdays don't count in the backwards," she said. Then she turned her head, for she could not manage her chin that day. I'll show you the picture that goes along. It said, Ada listened as the stranger imitated bird calls. You can see them sitting there at the spring. And he is kind of a strange-looking man. The man said, "So that's the way of it, your birthday. Now, just a moment, I may have something here." He dug into his knapsack and burrowed around for a moment. Then he pulled out a parcel. "I carry little things in here just in case of need. Yes, here's what I have for girls on their 10th birthdays." He took out a piece of pink silk ribbon and handed it to her. "It says Ada on it," he told her jokingly. "It would look fine in your hair." "It's not really for me?" Ada asked. After all, when her own parents forgot about presents, why would a stranger give her one? The man nodded. "It's beautiful," Ada told him, as she smoothed the ribbon tenderly across her lap. "It's the color of apple blossoms," the man pointed out. "That's why I always choose pink." Again, he burrowed in his knapsack. "There's something else I'd like to give you," he said. "It's the finest present in the world." He pulled out a large package. When he unwrapped it, Ada saw dozens of small bags made of deerskin. The man chose one of these bags and held it up. "This is my treasure," he announced. "And the most wonderful thing about it is that every year it will give you more gifts." "What is it?" Ada asked, for the words had a magic sound. "Want to see?" The man plucked open one end of the bag and took out a small black object. "A seed!" Ada exclaimed. She was both puzzled and disappointed. "An apple seed," the old man nodded gleefully. "But why do you carry around apple seeds with you?" Ada wanted to know. "We threw them away back home." "There are plenty of orchards around Boston," he reminded her. "Yes," Ada agreed, but she still did not understand why he thought that apple seeds were such a wonderful gift. A present of apple seeds was almost worse than no present at all. But the man had no chance to explain, for at that moment Mrs. Bartlett appeared with the wooden buckets which Ned had forgotten to fill. She stared in amazement when she saw a stranger sitting beside Ada. The man scrambled to his feet. "Don't fear," he told her. "It's only me. I was just passing through these parts and stopped for water. Then we two fell a-talkin'. I hear you're new settlers." Mrs. Bartlett eyed him closely and, like Ada, knew that he was a friend. "We've been here more than a year," she sighed, and the sigh meant what Ada had said, that it had seemed like 1,000 years. "Are you going far?" she asked, with a glance at his bare feet. "Yes, I'm aiming to go farther west into the Illinois country this trip. Maybe take a look at that big trading center around the turn of the lake. Onion Weed is its name, or Chicago in the Indian tongue. Maybe I'll push on as far as the Mississippi." Mrs. Bartlett looked at the stranger again, and with more interest than she had shown for weeks. "You're not settling here? You're just traveling through the wilderness for pleasure?" "I like the wilderness," the man nodded. "Ever since I was a little chap, I've loved the woods. But now, of course, I've got my work." He showed her what was in the little deer seed bags. "I'm preaching orchards. I'm spreading apple seeds through this frontier land." "Oh," cried Mrs. Bartlett with sudden recognition. "Then of course I know who you are. You're Johnny Appleseed." And she too sat down to rest against the tree. "That's what folks call me," he nodded, seating himself again. "Everyone knows about you," Mrs. Bartlett went on. "I've heard lots of tales. Some folks say you are a saint, and some—" Here she hesitated. "Some say I'm a fool," Johnny Appleseed finished for her. "They all agree that you've done great good," Mrs. Bartlett said hastily. She was embarrassed that he had guessed her meaning. "Why, you were the hero of Fort Mansfield years back, weren't you?" Ada looked up hopefully, for this sounded like a story, but Johnny Appleseed waved the tale aside. "God gives his children strength for every great need," he said. "You've often saved settlers from Indian massacres," Mrs. Bartlett persisted. I don't want anyone hurt, Johnny Appleseed agreed. But I'm friends with the Indians, too. They are also my brothers. I've lived with them in their wigwams, eaten their meals, nursed their sick, and played with their children. But of course my business is mostly with my own people. Again he held up his apple seeds, but the sound of running feet and Ned's shouts interrupted him. Sorry, Ma, I forgot the water, but I'll carry the buckets back. Then Ned saw the stranger and gasped. A grin spread over his face at the sight of the strange clothes. For the love of jumping Jonah, who are you? He asked rather impolitely. Again the newcomer was on his feet. Half bowing, he introduced himself. I'm Jonathan Chapman, but folks call me Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed, snickered Ned. Ada knew that her brother had noticed only the burlap coffee sack and the cardboard hat. What he had not seen were the steady gray eyes that had told her and her mother that this man was a friend. Quickly she burst out with the one point which she knew would make her brother value the stranger. He's not afraid of Indians, she told Ned. He's lived with them. Ned looked doubtfully at this man who did not even carry a gun. How many have you killed, he wanted to know. Not a one, Johnny Appleseed answered solemnly. I'm not a killer. Then Mrs. Bartlett roused herself to defend the stranger. He's the man who saved Fort Mansfield years back, son. You've heard the tale. The settlers had a wind of a coming Indian raid, and this man was the only one who dared set out through the woods to fetch reinforcements from 30 miles away. Is it true, she asked, turning to the visitor, that you made the round trip there and back in 24 hours? I was a good walker in those days, Johnny Appleseed answered modestly. Anyone would have done the same if he'd known the trails like me. Besides, I've always been friends with the Indians and never looked for trouble with them. If I've saved white men's lives, I've helped red men too, and I'm proud of that. Everyone should look after his own, of course, but I'm sorry to say there are some settlers who wouldn't lift a finger for an Indian. And why should they? Ned wanted to know. The savages would scalp us quick enough. They haven't scalped me, Johnny Appleseed answered. The white man often starts the trouble. I couldn't sleep nights if I'd cheated the Indians out of the land or hounded them from these parts the way the white men have. It was only a little while back that the whole Potawatomi tribe was driven west like cattle. I went with them a ways to help. They were hustled along so fast that there was much suffering, and there was no one else to care for the sick and the old who fell by the way. But they're not all gone yet, Mrs. Bartlett moaned. There's a few stragglers, Johnny Appleseed admitted. Some come back for the hunting season, some are homesick, and maybe some of them do aim to pay off a score on a white man who took their land. Mrs. Bartlett shuddered. Well, Ned asked, what else do you do besides help the Indians? For a third time, Johnny Appleseed held out his little deerskin bags. My work is mostly with these. I follow the frontier, preaching orchards. Everywhere I go, I carry seeds to start orchards in the wilderness. Ned was more puzzled than ever. But what do you get out of it? Folks won't pay you for apple seeds. I get along, the man answered. Folks pay me what they can, a penny here for each tree. If they haven't the money, they sometimes give me cornmeal or nice clothes. The mention of nice clothes was almost too much for Ned, whose eyes were on the burlap shirt. Johnny Appleseed understood and laughed with him. Trouble is, he explained, I always meet up with someone who needs the clothes more than I do. Just last week I earned a pair of shoes and a warm coat, but the next day I ran into some poor settlers. The man's feet were bleeding and the woman was shivering. So naturally, the woman was soon wearing my coat and the man my shoes. Fact is, I feel best in this outfit. Nobody else wants it, and so it seems rightly mine. To Ned, Johnny Appleseed's job was still a mystery. But who wants an orchard in the backwoods anyhow, he asked. The man did not answer at once. Then he murmured in a low, tantalizing tone, Do you remember large, red-cheeked, juicy apples? Oh, I want one, exclaimed Ada, half expecting him to pull apples from his knapsack. Johnny Appleseed's eyes were still on Ned as he went on. An apple would taste mighty good right now, wouldn't it? And do you like roasted apples on a winter evening? Or maybe you would prefer a mug of apple cider in the fall or a deep dish apple pie. Oh, stop, cried Ned, his mouth watering. Ma, do you remember the pies you used to make back in Boston? Mrs. Bartlett only sighed. Johnny Appleseed turned toward her. Maybe you would like an orchard by your house. How would it be to look out every spring on an orchard in bloom? It's the most beautiful sight God ever made, and you can have it right here. It almost sounds like heaven, Mrs. Bartlett murmured. She smiled as she stood up, her first smile since her little boy had died. You'll stay for dinner with us, of course, she said. We've no apple pie or anything tasty, but you're welcome to share with us. I'll be proud to share, Johnny Appleseed accepted, and maybe we can start an orchard here as sort of a birthday gift for this little girl. He filled one of the wooden buckets, Ned took the other, and the four of them walked back to the house together. And that's the end of that chapter. I will be reading soon, chapter 3, and tell you more about Johnny Appleseed.